Hello everybody and welcome to our latest video looking at the American Civil War. Today we're going to look at the second half of 1862. There are some really important battles in this, particularly the Battle of Antietam. We've also got the Second Bull Run and Fredericksburg. So we're going to look at those. There are massive events that go on around this, most notably the Emancipation Proclamation. And that we'll look at in a later video when we look at the move towards full emancipation. We will fit it all in with early Reconstruction and look at the 13th Amendment. So that's all to come. Today we're going to concentrate on the war itself. Right, in the second half of 62, Lincoln is seen following the 7 Days War. He really needs more men. He sends out a recruitment call. He wants 300,000 more men signing up for 3 years. And he believes this would bring a speedy and satisfactory conclusion to the war. But getting enough recruits proves to be rather difficult. The economy is doing really well in the north. At this point, there's lots of jobs, there's lots of work in agriculture, and people have started to see the horrors of war and the death and the destruction. So they need to bring in financial incentives, and there's kind of expanding of federal power. It's like a quasi-draft, really, and there's militiamen being brought in as well. And they do eventually manage to get the number of men that they want. Now, we've got a bit of a divide in the Union side at this point. It really is developing. This, I've already mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation that will come later in 62. Well, earlier in 62, General Hunter had said he was abolishing slavery in the Union held areas of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Now, Lincoln actually revokes that order, and it's only a matter of months actually later that he brings in the Emancipation Proclamation himself. But again, there's still this balance to be had in terms of differing views on the Union side. An example of that is McClellan, who was very much against emancipation and said that this war was about defeating the armed rebellion in the South, not about changing things like slavery. Now, the Congress of 62 in the Union had empowered the government to enroll African Americans as soldiers. The Confiscation Act also allowed the confiscation of slaves from rebel slave owners. So we're starting to see movement in that direction. We'd seen kind of a further heightening of kind of the stakes at the point. General Pope had threatened but didn't actually carry out his threat to execute guerrilla fighters and expel civilians who wouldn't swear an allegiance whilst fighting in the West. This caused great anger in the Confederacy and threat of reprisal against Union prisoners of war. In the South, Lee is really starting to be championed, and they believe that what they've seen at 7 Days showed that the Union could be defeated, and ultimately the Confederacy could come out on top. So there's lots of things to ponder and think about at this point. Right, so our first kind of major battle that we're going to look at today is the Second Manassas, Second Battle of Bull Run. It takes place largely between the 29th and 30th of August in 62. It's in the Eastern Theatre, and it's Lee and Jackson versus Pope, and to a degree McClellan, and McClellan doesn't really get involved at all. It sits in his tent, writes to his wife, saying that Pope's going to lose his job. So, following the Battle of Cedar Mountain, the Union and Confederate armies have been manoeuvring and sparring around. I'm not sure I'm going to say this right. The Rappahannock River. Lincoln is saying, "Let's get on in with it, attack Richmond," and he's ordered McClellan to join forces with Pope, which of course McClellan does the normal McClellan things and drags his feet and doesn't want to do it. And the idea is that they're going to advance on Richmond. Lee is determined to strike first. He's not going to wait for the Union to come to him. He heads north with his men, and he actually sends Jackson round to the north of Pope, and Pope's still waiting for McClellan, and Pope decides to seek out Jackson's men. There's a lot of kind of toing and froing, and Jackson's got and his men have got their pace back after the previous sluggish display. They've gone back to the earlier times when they talked about his foot cavalry. And then what we then see is Pope makes a series of really quite terrible errors. He finds Jackson's army near Manassas, and he believes Jackson's army is retreating. So he attacks them, thinking he's attacking retreating men. He isn't. He fails to realise that actually what Jackson's doing is meeting up with more troops. And so we get more of Lee's army join, most notably under the group under the command of Longstreet, who attack the left flank of Pope. Pope's men are badly battered by this. He's taking significant losses. He then the next day he thinks the Confederates are retreating, and again he attacks them. Again, they're not retreating. They're just, this is a kind of a tactic of Jackson's. They're kind of trying to pull the Union forces onto them. They're there. They're entrenched. They're ready, and there's a really high casualty rate amongst the Union forces. I mean, overall, in this battle, we're talking about 9,000 casualties for the Confederacy, 16,000 for the Union. And it's therefore a really significant victory for the Confederate Army. Now, there's a lot of controversy about what happens here. Now, Pope gets the blame, and he did make mistakes, and McClellan is kind of promoted. Now, really, whether that was the right thing to do is very debatable, because actually Pope probably would have been in a much better position, and the battle would have gone very differently if McClellan had actually got out of his tent, moved his men, and been there in support. So you can argue McClellan does a huge amount that weakens Pope and his position in the battle, but it's Pope who gets the blame and McClellan who doesn't. Right. We're now on to one of the most significant battles of the war, and potentially one of the biggest turning points. So in here, we're going to see Lee versus McClellan and then Burnside in the Eastern Theater in Maryland. Right. So Lee has invaded Maryland mainly in hope to gain volunteers from Maryland to protect Virginia's harvest. He is hoping to get this knockout blow against the Union. He believes that if he gets this knockout blow, then Britain will recognise the Confederacy, and the Union will then start to fret and crumble under the threat of what's going on. Jackson manages to take Harper's Ferry, which you might remember from earlier videos when we looked at John Brown's raid in '59. So it's a federal arsenal. Jackson takes it actually really rather easily. But there is a kind of a real disaster for the Confederacy. Lee loses a copy of his operational orders, and they make their way into McClellan's hands. Now, this should be a game changer. If you're going to go into a battle with the opposition's battle plans, then you're at a huge advantage. But we have to remember the person gaining that huge advantage is McClellan, so whether he'll trust it and use it is a whole other matter. McClellan moves to force Lee back over the Potomac River. Lee decides not to continue a retreat, but actually hold a position at Antietam Creek. McClellan doesn't attack, despite the fact he has Lee completely hopelessly outnumbered. Of course, McClellan doesn't believe that's true and think it's the other way around, and this gives Jackson a chance to rejoin Lee's army. So, on the 17th of September, we see the Battle of Antietam. There's so much that happens. It's amazing to believe that this is only one day. This is the bloodiest day of the Civil War. In fact, this is one of the bloodiest days in terms of armed conflict. It is a horrendous amount of death and destruction. Now, essentially, it's in 3 bits: morning, midday, and afternoon. The morning saw fighting on a scale that hadn't really been seen in a kind of ferocity to it, and a scale of death on it that had not really been seen in the war. And there's reports about, it talks about just men just firing and firing and firing and bodies piling up. It then gets even more intense, arguably, in the fighting in midday. And the fighting in midday focuses around the Sunken Road, also referred to as Bloody Lane. And eventually the Union managed to take Bloody Lane and push the Confederates back. And actually, at this point, there's a huge gaping hole in the center of Lee's army, which McClellan could have driven fresh troops straight through the middle of, and then there would have been a decisive victory. But McClellan believes Lee's holding back a load of men, which he isn't, and therefore he proceeds very cautiously. And again, we see McClellan's failings. In the afternoon, the fighting then really focuses around what's often referred to as Burnside Bridge. Burnside's men have been being picked off as they've been trying to go across this bridge all day. Eventually, they managed to storm it at huge cost. Lots of men getting shot as they burst across it, and then they managed to kind of start pushing the Confederate army back up this flank. Confederate men then turn up. There are some reinforcements. The guys who've been at Harper's Ferry, been left behind at Harper's Ferry, now appear. A lot of them are dressed in blue. It causes absolute confusion. Oh, there's a lot of men dressed in blue uniforms coming towards us. Think Burnside's men. That's fine. That's our reinforcements. McClellan's actually done something. And no, it isn't. They're firing at us. And so Burnside's men's held off, and then they get hit by this counterattack. Eventually, through pure weight of numbers, the Confederacy are being pushed back. Lee holds his position, trying to kind of get McClellan to attack and see if he can pick McClellan off again. McClellan, of course, doesn't. Despite the fact he'd had actually two fresh divisions appear to kind of refill his stock of men. Lee, seeing that again, he's hugely outnumbered. Lee then retreats, and McClellan can claim victory at Antietam. Again, if you look at the details, yes, it is victory for the Union of Antietam. It's a much needed victory following a whole set of defeats that had been preceded it. But whether McClellan could claim any credit is really debatable. So why is this one so important? Well, it's the single bloodiest day or single bloodiest battle of the war. So just in one day, we see 11,000 Union casualties, 12,000 Confederate ones. This is 4 times the number of casualties suffered by America on the 6th of June, 44, with the Normandy beach landings. So we're talking death and injury on an unprecedented scale. The Antietam is a horrendous battle. Within days, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. I will look at that in more detail in another video later on. It really does alter the war, and it really does change things in a number of ways. One of the most important, which is there really is no way that the British now are likely to come in on the Confederate side. The idea that Lee is invincible is dented but not destroyed. I mean, he's theoretic in kind of he loses the battle. He's the one who retreats from the field, but he again has proved himself to be the much more capable general as opposed to McClellan. McClellan is now going to be replaced by Burnside because he fails to follow up this victory. Lincoln just gets so frustrated with him, going, right, okay, so you've got Lee's army on the run. You've got more men than them. Get this done. And McClellan's like, oh no, Lee's got more men than me. And he didn't. And eventually Lincoln decides that he's had enough of McClellan and replaces him with Burnside. Right. Later in the year then, we've got Fredericksburg. So this is Lee versus Burnside. Burnside does not prove to be any better than McClellan, though different. So we're going to have this attack on Fredericksburg. The Union engineers have been building these pontoon bridges to get men across. Some of them downriver are kind of defended by artillery and are going fine. The one going directly into Fredericksburg, it causes huge issue actually for the Union, because there's a group of Confederate sharpshooter snipers hiding in buildings nearby that just start sniping off engineers and soldiers as soon as it gets light. Following an artillery bombardment, the Union soldiers cross. They then loot Fredericksburg, and that's the night of the 11th. The main fighting takes place on the 13th, and what we see here is the left wing under Franklin just fails to break through. It could have broken through. It could have turned the tide, but Franklin holds back about half his men. Burnside had told him to attack with his full force. Franklin doesn't do it. And so, again, Burnside's going to get the fall for this because he's the guy in charge. But not necessarily helped by General Franklin. Burnside's attacks therefore turn out to be largely suicidal, as he attacks Lee's main force. And again, whilst I've been critical of McClellan being too cautious, Burnside is just the complete opposite. So he's trying to attack Lee's men. Lee's men are behind good cover. They've got the high ground. Lee loses about 5,000 men. There are about 13,000 casualties on Burnside's side. A lot of these are just a huge number of men sat dead by this wall at the bottom of Murray's Heights, and the impact of this is really big on the Union. It really destroys a lot of Union morale, and a lot of Union soldiers were left with this image of a huge number of bodies in front of the stone wall that have got missing limbs, even missing heads, or there are bits of limbs and things around, and shells and brains and all sorts all over the place. It's a really horrendous sight, particularly as the Union force comes to kind of retrieve the dead after a couple of days, when the truce is agreed on the 15th. And again, Lee appears to be invincible, and the Union is in crisis. There's all kind of confusion in Washington. What's going to happen next? Will Lincoln survive, or is cabinet going to resign? The war that they were hoping was going to be over by the end of '62, it looks like it's nowhere near over, and in fact the Union keep on suffering these terrible defeats. Right, thank you very much for watching. Again, I will move on through the war, so we'll be looking at 63 in my next video, and then we'll go through 64, 65, end of the war, and then we'll get into Reconstruction. And when we do Reconstruction, we're going to look at things like the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the forerunner to the 13th Amendment, and we'll look at all the significance of all of that. Please remember to like, to share, to subscribe, and I'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much for watching.